All right, welcome this afternoon. Thanks for joining us. The very first, got kind of thrown off there, very first thing that we're going to do today is a work session, and we're going to discuss the 18-19 budget review again. So, Michelle?
Good evening, everybody. So we are going to continue and pick up where we started, actually this similar spot where we began the week last week, and that's discussing the some different tax scenarios that we have been going back and forth and looking at. And we had distributed via email the charts that we had discussed last week, and we brought extra copies in case anybody needs one. But the conversation was, we have $776,000 in additional revenue, and it's needed in our fiscal year 19 proposed budget to help balance the general fund at current service levels. And in looking at $776,000 and how that could break down, there's different options. We can do an overall tax rate increase. We could look at implementing a different type of tiered tax rate structure and system. And so one of the things that we discussed was because we're not able to break down in as much detail as what we would like in a software system to implement this tiered tax rate system, looking at just what is classified as a category of apartments, which is 4 units or more, and looking at if we do overall tax rate across the board, absolutely no increase anywhere else, what does that look like just on apartments to get to the $776,000, and that's a 33.5-cent tax rate increase, versus the opposite end of the spectrum, if we did a 3-cent tax rate increase overall for everybody plus apartments, it gets us right to the 776. And then one of the things I think that we left off with that we did not have in the actual chart last week was something that the mayor had recommended. So we looked at if you have 2 cents overall to all other tiers and categories, but then 10 cents for just the apartment units, that would get us approximately $712,000. So just about $60-some thousand short. So we would need to make some other reductions and adjustments in what's currently proposed in order to be balanced. And I think we left the conversation that we were going to try to come back and see if we could find a specific scenario that we could get a majority so that we could move forward. Donna Spickler and I need to work on the public notice and actually get that out and in the paper before our public meeting, which is our public hearing meeting, which is scheduled for Tuesday, May the 15th. So is there any discussions or additional thoughts on the different tax scenarios?
Well, I would just repeat what I said. I just had a discussion with Michelle to make sure that I did not understand. I thought that all the apartments, multi-use dwellings that are used for rentals were appraised by the same method as homeowner occupied. And very recently this week I found out I'm wrong on that there is an income base, and I don't know what the difference in those appraisal methods do. The theory that I've been working on is everything is basically appraised the same, but an apartment has a lot more services and it's not appraised any higher. I'd be very curious to know how that all works. I again think for the first year that we're starting 3 and 5 is appropriate, and what I would do with the extra revenue raised, I know in the budget we're calling for $10,000 a year for the next 3 years to the museum, and then for the next 2 years we can figure out where we're going to cut $10,000 from people that we've been giving it to. I would do 3 and 5, and I would commit the $30,000 to the museum this year instead of just doing another thing of saying we don't have the money this year, but yeah, we'll have it next year, and yeah, we'll have it the year after. That would be my recommendation. And then I'd like to get more information on how the appraisals are done.
Yeah, do they appraise apartments every single year? Because the appraisal process is
No.
a 3-year
It's
process.
three- it's the-
The assessment period is the same, so all of our properties are reassessed in a 3-year cycle. And then it's my understanding, and we can certainly look at including and inviting some members of our local SDET offices, and they may even need to reach out to Baltimore, because sometimes some of the things, once it starts getting into too detailed of a question, and if it's considered, what they consider to be commercial, we don't always have regional expertise here locally in Hagerstown or Washington County. But there is an income methodology, there is a form or a spreadsheet. It's from what I understand, it's a 3-year look where you can include your income and your expenses. So if I'm and in theory, the way that I'm assuming that it would work, in theory, is if, I'm I have apartments and I have vacant units. Anywhere during that 3-year period, that vacancy, I'm gonna have less in revenue, a lot of the same in expenses. That is going to actually help reduce my assessed value.
So they can go appeal it every single year.
They can, yes.
Okay. I mean, so if
Anybody can appeal every single year, but yes,
every single, even though we're only
Yes, even though
assessed
you only
once
get-
every 3 years.
correct.
Okay.
What about a gradual plan? Maybe like a 15-year plan where if we're talking about, the apartment complexes, it's 3 cents a year for 5 years, 3-cent increase for 5 years, and then we back it down to 2 cents for 5 years, and then 1 cent for 5 years. So then it's, we have a plan over the next, 15 years as to how to pay for things like the theater and, the urban improvement projects and such. And I'm not saying 3 cents is the answer on the apartments but, on the multi-unit properties, kind of a phase-in type of thing.
And we could build something like that into the projections, but you would still have to every year come back and actually set your tax rates.
But if that was a goal that we had, and at least we're planning for future projects and kind of setting the stage of sorts.
I think I asked you last week, do we have the constant yield number yet?
We do have the constant yield notice. We received it in February, and it is anticipated by our state assessor's office that our assessable values are going to decline by 0.9% over current fiscal year 18, and that is due in large part to what they feel that they have experienced with our trends in assessments and appeals.
And appeals. It's more of.
And abatements.
Yeah, abatements and appeals, yeah.
My personal feeling is that, number one, to echo what Councilmember Metzner said, I was unaware of any kind of a differential in the assessment process until just a few minutes ago when he brought it up before the meeting. So we do need to find out about that. But going short-term forward here, I favor the 3 and 5 cent solution. And as far as the overage goes, between the 776 and the 826, I would like to say commit it to the museum, but my personal preference is that we hold that because I know we have a $200,000 potential liability. The city's going to offer $200,000 toward the Maryland Theater. The county has not yet come up with that. And the county doesn't know if they're going to be able to do that until some of their negotiations on the, or until they see how things are going with the Board of Education. So I would not like to commit any money that we may have to go back and ask for back.
So just sort of keep the extra in contingency.
I would keep it in contingency if we could, and then, if we can release it to the museum, I'd be all in favor of that.
But then when we asked for it to be able to use it, would like to be able to use it, I think.
Yeah.
Yes,
Wait until the close of the year to decide. what-
yeah, if it's in the, yeah, it can be,
Absolutely.
it can be
Only
by-
the 50,000, Mr. Mayor.
I understand what you're saying, but I mean, you know, we like to have some
Yeah, what is that,
guarantee
50,000? Yeah.
when we ask that you won't be throwing hate bombs at me.
But I think the, you know, the differential there does, while it doesn't do anything dramatic for the owner occupied house, the owner that is paying a disproportionate share, it's at least kind of sets the tone and does a little bit to help.
Kristen? Where do you stand on this?
I don't support the three.
So do you think that it should be, so what do you support?
I think the differential should be greater.
Shelley?
I mean, can you elaborate on a great, I mean,
Well, you know, I can understand where he's coming from. I mean, that's why I offered the 2 and 10, because I think if you're gonna make a difference and you want the property owners, the single-family homeowner to understand that, listen, we know that you've carried this budget for, you know, 50 years, and we understand that it's been disproportional to you because you're carrying the burden of the budget, and this, you know, is a way to try to find some equality, although it's nowhere near where it actually probably should be, but there is some equality, a little bit closer to an equality here. And, you know, I mean, I've heard people, you know, the only reason I actually offer up 10 is because I've heard people say, listen, if you did 25, I'd be like zapping out, but, you know, if you did 10, I'd swallow it and be okay.
I would support the 10 eventually, but as for the first pass, the only thing I'm thinking about is the rental property owner. They have tenants in there with leases. They're not going to be able to pass this back. I mean, basically, they're going to take the whole hit on this tax increase. If we could phase the increase in over a period of years, then that would give them a chance to build the increased property taxes into their P&L models on their properties.
I'm also curious, I may not get quite as many constituent calls as other members do, but has anybody been getting phone calls from single-family homeowners saying, I think this two-tiered tax system is fantastic, it's gonna give me relief, and you're putting the burden where it belongs? Because I sure haven't.
No.
I've gotten phone calls from apartment and landlords, and I've gotten phone calls from some very responsible folks too, who are not screaming at me. But for instance, pointed out to me that there is a difference in assessment methodology. I did not know that till I got that phone call. And also pointing out to me that they could support a 3 and 5 with the knowledge of what's happening, and pointing out what you did, Austin, also with leases. I don't see an outcry from our citizens that this is a greatest idea since apple pie. And I don't hear anybody screaming bloody murder about getting it started. But I think we're still a long way from completely understanding what we really need to understand on this issue. And again, we're gonna be having a stormwater management fee coming down the line. And I just can't get over the fact of how much we seem so concerned about being business unfriendly, while at the same time we're talking about 10, 11-cent tax increases on anybody. And I hear what everybody says about the reality, but I'm just so surprised that when perception counts, we talk about what you gotta do to change perception that's not true. And now we're gonna create a perception for not a whole lot of anything. I mean, when you look at the figures, to get up to something that's really meaningful here, you're gonna have to make a huge tax hike. And I just think it's also, especially for Bob and Kristen, who know me, somewhat ironic that I'm the one saying that we shouldn't do a large tax increase. I've never been the only one
Well,
probably in the
and-
council
and-
ever that's not been opposed to tax increases, but this perception, I just
And
think
just-
we gotta go slowly.
You know, I hear that, Lou, and I understand it, and I know where you're coming from, and 10 cents is hard to swallow, but, you know, what some of your very first comments were about how these landlords are gonna go back and they're gonna appeal this decision anyway, and they're gonna get, you know, it's income-based, and it's all that. I mean, you know, is there any way to figure out, in past, like just last year when we raised taxes, you know, what did we see on the apartment side of it? Did we see, you know, those revenues kind of like stay the same even though we raised taxes? I mean, is there a way to look at that? I mean, because if that's the case, then they're appealing this anyway, and it's falling back on the, you know, we're not gonna accomplish what we set out to do anyway. We're not gonna see that, even at 5 cents, at $115,000. That's my biggest fear, is that we do this and we don't do it enough, and then we end up, you know, at the end of the year, finding out that, you know, come December when it all shakes out, finding out that we, you know, actually stayed at the same amount even though we increased by 5 cents the apartment's tax. I mean, you know, if we don't do any differential, then we'll go do the same thing anyway. They're gonna go appeal it, and
Correct. They can.
Yes.
I think it's a losing battle, period.
So
And the homeowners can still pay the majority of the cost for everything.
part of the reason that I asked for the breakout, on this revised sheet that you provided, where you have overall on apartments, if everybody got a copy, and then tax scenario rates. And if you look at the application, and let's just look at the application of 3 and 3, meaning 3 cents gets applied across the board. 3 cents to what we consider are the single unit, right? Make up $706,000 of that tax increase, while the apartments make up $70,000. Now, folks may wonder then, well, how many apartments are we talking about if we're cutting them out? The apartments that includes, and this doesn't include the ones that are in pilot, by the way. I mean, pilot are getting, you know, a 90% reduction in their taxes. So they're riding on $10 on the 100, basically, which makes up, I think, in this city about 1,300 units, or about 10 to 15% of the total rental housing stock are paying taxes at 10 cents on the dollar. So we're already behind the 8 ball, so to speak, on 10 to 15% of the rental residential housing stock. If you cut out this additional or this other amount, and you look at the sheet, and I think staff gave it to us last week, it totals about 4,000 units, which means that out of your 9 or 10,000 apartment units or apartment structures that are more than 4, you're talking about 4,000 more units, or about 50%, are then picking up just this $70,000 mark, which means the remaining units are picking up 90%, right, of this tax increase. That's what's happening. You look at 700,000, you look at 70,000. Those remaining single units are picking up 90% of the tax increase. And you can break those numbers down a little further and you say, okay, about 8,000 of that remaining 15,000 are owner occupied, single family. And so if you look at rentals altogether, rentals are taxed at about somewhere between, in this 4,000 units, about $300 to $600 is about the average. You step up to townhouses and you're talking about $800. You step up to single-family homes and you're talking about $1,200 a piece, right? And so every penny on that is why you see that differential grow significantly. If you go to the 2 and 10 figure, even if you went to the 2 and 10 figure, that means that those 4,000 units are paying 5 times the rate in pennies on taxes. They're still only picking up 30% of the total tax increase. Now, you asked me to elaborate, and I look at those numbers, and I can't make those numbers make sense in my head when I have to apply those figures to sort of this fair share average unit cost. And part and parcel to being able to do that is to look at the $28 million that we bring in general fund taxes and know that roughly somewhere arguably between 60 and 80% of that money is going to two basic services that all the units in the city equally use. And our folks could argue, the degree of equalness that those public safety services are used, but there's a reality, and there isn't any scenario until you get up to the top two where the tax rate is 23 times those single unit tax rate, until you get to a scenario where it surpasses the other one. And so, when you get down to that 4,000 units, and you see that it's going to make up about 30%, and the remaining are going to make up 70%, and maybe 65, because maybe 5% of it's made up by those units that are getting the pilot, maybe. I can't look at that and say that 3 and 5 is starting down the road of recognizing that. And at the end of the day, and I did this, I took probably a dozen different examples from the pages that Scott sent that had the individual properties. And again, they were ranging from $300 a unit to $600 a unit is about the tax rate per unit. And I tried to apply these different scenarios to about 12 different examples of those apartment buildings that were given. And in no case did any one of those examples exceed I think it was the $34 that 3 cents will create to me as an average. I mean, my house is about as average as it gets within the tax structure. And so, I think at the break even was somewhere in the 6 to 8 cent range where it was finally sort of apples to apples per unit. But the huge variable was obviously, what the value of that per unit tax is. And so, there, I've elaborated.
Is there a way to get us some information on what our 2.8% tax increase last year did at the apartment from 4 units up? And see what that amount in real dollars. What that amounted to.
And I think Scott's here,
Is that
so he
possible?
should be able to pull the information and compare 17 versus 18 on the apartments on the revenue side and tell you what that
Can you-
total looked like.
I'd be very interested to see how much we gained at that 2.8% increase last year on those rentals.
Okay, so based on that, has anybody changed their mind? Is anybody willing to do the higher differential, as Councilmember Alshire suggested, or Councilmember McIntyre? I mean, typically, I don't sit here and do this and say, I'm digging my
No,
heels
but
in, I can't go
unfortunately,
forward, but
it's a-
really, I gotta get a notice in the paper.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that we can't change our minds when you take your vote, but we really, I need to have clear direction, or at this
Understand.
point, we can just do the notice at an overall 3-cent tax rate increase because we know what that looks like and put it in the paper. And then come back and we'll have to fix it.
It has to be in Monday.
Right. Our days are,
Bob, do you know, is someone gonna be with them all?
She'll be here at some, she hopefully will be here at some point in time, but I haven't gotten anything new from her.
so we can look at just a few other things, as some of you have already mentioned and touched upon. One of the things that I know, several of you get because we mention it every single year, but in section 1, there's a couple of charts just on general fund revenue with, breakdown also on the expenses. So section 1, page 26, is the information on revenue, and you can see for fiscal year 19 budget, property tax revenue is with the $776,000 included in it would be approximately 30.6 million, and that is roughly 67% of our total general fund dollars. So 30.6 million compared to the total revenue of 45.4 million. On the expense side, or on page 28, you're gonna see at the very top a chart on expenditures by type, and there is a subtotal at the top that shows total wages and benefits in the general fund. And the fiscal year 19 proposed budget is $30.2 million. So $30.2 million in our largest share of our expenses, or another 66.8, roughly 67% of all of our expenses are on our wages and benefits side. And if we look on the revenue and we didn't have that additional $776,000 in property tax revenue, our wages and employee benefits would be outpacing and be at a much higher level than our property tax revenue. On page 27, there's a breakdown by expenses, but this time it's by areas. Also one of the things that we touch upon. But in fiscal year 19 budget, when you look at just police and fire operating budgets in the fiscal year 19 proposed budget, that amounts to 22.5 million in expense, or approximately 50% of our overall expenses. One of the other key things to note on this page, if you would, is under contributions to other agencies. It is $405,000, which is exactly $200,000 more than we discussed in October when we sat here as a group and covered the agency contributions. But again, that is an additional $200,000 that we were looking to give to the Maryland Theater. We had worked a plan for contributions to other agencies to look at possibly granting or pledging $500,000 to the Maryland Theater by doing $200,000 in fiscal year 19, $100,000 in each year, fiscal year 20, 21, and 22. But that literally means in fiscal year 20, 21, and 22, out of our total $205,000 that we have in agency contributions, half of that would be earmarked for the Maryland Theater for the following 3 years. The agency contributions are broken down in a little bit more detail in section 3. We want to look at that just so that we can kind of look again at the agencies that we currently contribute to.
Page
So
57.
it's section 3, page 57, and it's at the bottom. And one of the things that Councilmember Mentzner had mentioned. So if you look in our fiscal year 19 proposed budget, you see 405,000 there. We were also looking at providing a pledge to the museum to do $10,000 in addition to what we normally fund to them. And this $10,000 was $10,000 in 19, 20, and 21 for a total of $30,000 towards their HVAC unit project and installation. So in fiscal year 19, instead of doing just $40,500 to the museum, we increased that by 10 and took out the 10,000 that would be in unspecified agency contributions in order to be able to provide that to the museum. So again, just wanted to make everybody aware of the information that was there because it is different than what we discussed when we sat here in October and looked. I know there have been several agencies that have come forth since this time, and there is nothing in the current fiscal year 19 budget or out-year projections right now for the Discovery Station, Brooks House, Dolman Black Museum. I mean, there are a multitude of others, but they were not incorporated into this budget cycle. Wasn't able to. And then last, I'm going to jump us back one more time because it's a chart that's important and one of the things that we looked at and added last year at this time, and that's in section 1 on page 10. There's an amenities chart, and this amenities chart includes everything that we've really defined as an amenity that we provide and shows fiscal year 18 projections as well as fiscal year 19 proposed budget. And so within the general fund, between the farmers market, the municipal pool, Hager House, Train Museum, Municipal Stadium, our parks, which I would just note that our parks do include the Hagerstown Cultural Trail. And then in fiscal year 19, it also includes some money for the plaza within the urban improvement project, ice rink, recreation, and then all events. So within that chart, I'm providing to you information that we receive from each of those in revenue, what we have in direct costs, operating costs, and then the next two columns are a reflection of what we have in our capital project section, and if we anticipate receiving any funding towards those capital projects in those areas with a total. So at the top, the general fund, fiscal year 18 projected, you will see approximately $3 million in brackets. And that just means for those areas that I just mentioned, we need $3 million in general fund tax supported monies to help cover and provide these services. And then if you go and look straight across that same place for fiscal year 19 budget, about $4.8 million. I mentioned that events are included on here. We do have a separate breakout that shows just the expenses for all of those events. It doesn't include the actual revenue, and it is actually included in section 3. We do include other things on here for the people at home who can't see this chart, including the golf course, parking fund, property management fund. And under property management specifically, we have the art gallery and the bureau box. I know that is a very high level, and I know that we have a meeting starting at 7, so I didn't want to go too in-depth and get too involved in too many schedules. But if there's any questions on any of those or on any of the numbers, I'm more than happy to discuss them a little bit further now and additional details later. Looking forward at the next couple weeks, I am anticipating having a conversation and looking at our economic redevelopment fund because some of our properties and our economic incentive programs are within that fund. And especially after last week here, we know incentives are a priority and one of the things we want to look at, but again, it comes down to helping to identify a sustainable funding source so that we can actually get those incentive programs off the ground and keep them going. I'm going to look at CDBG.
Rodney, under the municipal stadium. The direct operating expense of 23,922. What? I mean, is that just manpower?
Say that one more time. The
The
$24,900?
Yeah.
So we cover, sorry, Rodney, you are back here.
Yeah, that's why I called his name.
It's okay.
Things like pest control, insurance, just miscellaneous things like that.
Okay.
Some repairs that we made over the course of the year.
Above and beyond the 35,000 that we
Yes.
do in capital. Okay, okay,
Yeah.
all right.
So the 35,000, we try to keep, identify projects and keep within the actual CIP or the capital project. And then the operating, as Rodney mentioned, will show under the operating category.
All right,
Those
okay.
routine maintenance kind of costs. After we look at economic redevelopment fund and the CDBG fund, one of the things that we definitely want to get back in front of everybody and discuss is our parking fund, and specifically talk about parking rates and where we need to go for the future. And then time permitting, golf course, and the rest of the utility funds.
Yeah, let's go.
Do we want to cover these charts in detail? I mean, do you want me to back up and cover and kind of walk through the amenity chart?
Michelle Scott came up to.
I'm sorry.
Can I just make sure I understand what you were asking for as far as a tax increase goes? You want to see the increase on just the apartment class from 17 to 18 with the tax increase?
Right, with
The
the,
revenue.
with
The
with the
revenue.
2.8 that we
With the
initiated
2.8?
last year, right.
So you want to see FY 17 and FY 18?
Right,
Just for apartments?
yeah.
Okay.
And keeping in mind that that was actually constant yield only, so.
Yeah, that was.
Hopefully.
Yeah, that was just a
Correct.
constant yield, so,
But we can run the report and take a look.
yes.
Cool. We're gonna give it 5 more minutes.
I think if we could get, mainly tonight, a majority direction to Michelle and Donna.
Well, I'm hoping
What
that
to
someone
advertise.
shows up this evening yet, and we can get her input. I know apparently Austin and Lou are good at the 3 and 5. Shelley?
I mean, I understand where everyone is coming from with the differential, you know, with the services and such. I mean, I'm okay with the 3 and 5. I think that, you know, I have to kind of side with Lou and, you know, this perception thing, and then we're talking about, you know, all these other fees that we're, you know, increasing parking and, you know, all the other things that go along with it. And we're trying so hard to encourage positive talk about our city. So, I mean, again, if we did something like you know, if we thought about a plan over the next 10 to 15 years, you know, which I know is, we may not all be here, but, I mean, I err on the side of 3 and 5, actually. As much as I understand the other part. I don't want to increase them at all, just for the record. None of it.
But then the three of you would be comfortable if that's what we advertised?
Anybody have more questions for Michelle that she can answer this evening?
Thank you, Michelle.
Just a quick question on the parking deck. The parking deck, I know we had capital expenditures for the new equipment and everything.
Yes.
Is that forecasted, or the intention is to have that be a break-even or a profit center at some point in the future, or are we always gonna run that as a cost?
Yes, so I think you're looking probably at the amenity chart when we're discussing that, so, yes.
Page 10.
It was, there was a couple of things driving some of our estimated actual information in the parking fund. Yes, we had anticipated the capital equipment purchase, but, right as we were getting our vendors lined up, we had the equipment fail, and was one of the reasons that we were moving forward, because we could no longer get parts. So then we had a period of time where the gates were open and free, so we knew that that was gonna occur in fiscal year 18, so we adjusted our numbers for that. And then also with the, purchase price, approximately $280,000 for the equipment. So parking fund for fiscal year 18 looks a little bit different in our projections than where they ended fiscal year 17, 16, 15. Also, is a little different from where we project in the out years for them as well, specifically fiscal year 19's budget. So definitely breaking even and turning back around in fiscal year 19.
Okay.
Anything else? Okay,
Okay, thank you.
thank you very much. We're gonna break until 7 o'clock for our regular session.